Welcome to week 3 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence Program. Just start off with announcements. Week 7, I'm going to have a job talk. What I want to do is just talk about jobs, getting a job in the intelligence field, Department of Defense, larger federal government as well. So if you have questions, please let me know beforehand, and please let me know what you want to discuss so I can talk in more detail during week 7. And what we'll do is we'll have a Zoom session, group 4, 5, and 6. We'll brief, and then we'll roll into 20, 25 minutes and talk about jobs. So we'll shoot for week 7 on that. And then paper 1 is due right now, depending on when you are watching this. So current events, Jacksonville shooting. So this happened a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who don't know, this was a shooting at a gaming convention in Jacksonville, Florida. And the so what of this is that someone who had mental health issues, who has been taking psychotic medications, had been institutionalized involuntarily. He was still able to get a gun and still able to commit this crime. Now, I don't want to get into the gun control issue, but there's a couple of issues that come up here, and this has to do with whether it's mental health or radicalization. And the issue is people are on the radar of either mental health officials or on law enforcement for terrorism, and they still commit these crimes. How do they do it? And the issue that we have is in a free society, we have what people do that are suspicious or even go into mental health issues on one side, and the ability to arrest somebody or detain them for one reason or another. And that gap in between is where, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's lone wolves, unfortunately operate and can conduct their attacks. So that's the issue going forward. And again, this has happened over and over again for all the various shootings that we've had, to the Orlando shooting, to the Boston Marathon bomber. People have been on the radar screen of law enforcement, but we have not been able to close that gap. And so going forward, I want you to think about how we do close that gap, or at least make it harder to operate in that gap if you want to engage in nefarious activity. Now, let me talk about guns for a second. People have said we should have no-fly list and making sure people can't purchase guns if they're on the no-fly list or on the mental health watch list. And that's part of it. And different states, depending on what state you have, do have mental health watch lists where you can't purchase guns if you are involuntarily committed. So a couple of issues with that is, okay, at what level does somebody lose their right to access guns? If they're involuntarily committed, if they're taking a heavy prescription drug that's an antipsychotic drug, if they see a therapist once, where on that line does somebody get their access to guns? And then if you look at the terrorism issue, at what level of radicalization? If they're on the no-fly list, most people would agree, but I guess we still can't do it, that they should be restricted to guns. So that's the other issue. Now let's flip that issue on its head. If you were law enforcement or you're in the mental health community, what you'd really like to know is someone pops hot on the no-fly list, or there's some mental health issue there, and then you can backtrack that they've just purchased 12 AR-15s. That is an indicator that they're about to commit some sort of crime or cause a lot of harm. That would require a national gun registry. That would require every gun that gets purchased to be registered in some database so that you know that when they pop hot on some list, whether it's no-fly list or a mental health list, that you can trace back how many guns, their gun purchase history. That would be very helpful to law enforcement. I don't think you'll ever fly with the American public, and I'll let you decide on whether you think that's a good idea or not, whether that crosses into civil liberties or not, or just like anything else, it's worth the trade-off. Your decision on that. So week three review of week of last week. So the requirements, I think we hit that pretty hard. Just integrated, or it kicks off the collection plan. And as I mentioned in those lectures, they have to be tight and focused so that you can collect on it. And I think that's what I'm hoping. And you saw that in the example of the collection plan I sent out last week. So I hope that comes out in your papers that you're handing in today. We then went into intelligence traps, or the beginnings of these structured analytical techniques. The big things: confirmation bias. And you saw that in the movie Confessions. You'll see that in other case studies we talk about, where you're only looking for evidence to confirm your first thought process. We all do that. It is, you can't set aside your biases on this. But I think it's just important that when you recognize you're doing it, and again, you're looking for evidence that confirms and you're disregarding evidence otherwise. And then mirror imaging, and you'll see this time and time again. And I think we even saw this in the run-up when we're talking about North Korea and their nuclear weapons and their denuclearization. We assume the actor is going to operate in the same manner we are. We assume his incentives are the same incentives that we have, and we ignore disparities in culture or disparities in economics or disparities in just mindset and psychology. That is a very typical issue that again comes up. You'll see it in the Yom Kippur War case study. You'll see it in the Iraq WMD case study, where policymakers are again using their own viewpoints to assess a potential adversary. And then again, the documentary, the Confessions, and I can't emphasize this enough going forward. I mentioned this in the discussion sections. Take the theory that's talked about in class and apply it to the case study that we go into. This week it was the Confessions. I wanted you to apply all those intelligence traps and apply it to the case study. And I want you to do that going forward. We're going to have theory, and then you have case study. Show me that you have applied the theory to the case study in your discussion sections. I will take off points this week if you didn't mention the Confessions in your discussion section, because it's almost as if you didn't even read it or didn't even watch the case study. So the case study was the Confessions, and this is again classic. Maybe classic confirmation bias isn't the right term, because this is more like criminal confirmation bias. That you had an initial theory and everything was wrapped around that theory, and as you saw in the video, it got to a level of ridiculousness that if it wasn't happening to real people would be kind of a comedy. Ignoring the DNA evidence, trying to fit this random person to the three people that you've already arrested falsely. That's really confirmation bias taken to the 10th power. Vividness bias. You saw that in the Confessions. The detective knows, and every law enforcement personnel probably knows, that a confession will be a lot more dramatic than scientific evidence, than even other witness evidence, than timeline evidence. A confession is always going to be vivid, and it's always going to play to that vividness bias. And you saw that when they were playing it in open court, how the everyone reacted to that. So again, we fall into that trap of it looks good, but it doesn't really quantitatively or qualitatively serve as evidence. So that's a key point, again, going forward. And then finally, Georgetown values. I don't know how many people are Catholic or Jesuit or really even religious, or really care about this kind of stuff, but Georgetown does try and look at justice and social justice as a keystone of your education here. And I think this is a case, and as I mentioned in that article that I sent out, these folks weren't exonerated until this past year, 2017. and you see the justice system kind of fail these folks. And we're hoping with this case study is that if you go, for those of you who are in law enforcement or even in just these positions where you get to make decisions on people's lives and their future, that you have a sense of justice, of what's right versus what's convenient. And I'll just, again, I can't emphasize this enough. It wasn't just a rogue detective here. It was juries, it was appellate courts, it was judges that all fell into these traps and all failed these defendants here. So moving forward, looking at week 3, so now we get into our historical case studies. This week is Strategic Surprise. The 2 historical case studies are the Pearl Harbor and Yom Kippur War. And again, if you're in this work, you should have some sort of appreciation for history. And these case studies, I think, are good not just for history and for the intelligence community, but they also, whether you're going into criminal law enforcement, business, or whatever your focus area is, the same issues that we talked about, failures in the collection cycle, analytical biases, that are going to be prevalent here, are prevalent throughout our society. And I think these case studies highlight that. So Pearl Harbor is the first one. Yom Kippur War is the second one. As we go forward, look at what were the failures. And what I want you to do is look at the collection cycle or the intel cycle and see, think about where the breakdown was. Was it in collection? Was it in analysis? Was it in requirements? Was it the analysts didn't communicate to the military leaders properly? Were there underlying circumstances? And I think this might characterized as just stuff happens, bad luck happens that causes the intelligence failures. You could have the best intel communities and the best analysts, but sometimes there's just bad luck. So as you're doing the readings, the lectures, tell me where the failures, where the breakdowns occurred for these 2 case studies. And then the documentaries, the reading, the Dahl, excellent reading. In fact, you will read the whole book in my class. You're just going to read a few chapters for this week, but it explains again where the failures were along the chain. The Avi Shalom Yom Kippur War article, again, that'll talk about the failures of the vaunted, quote unquote, vaunted Israeli intelligence service and why they failed to analyze why 2 known adversaries, why they failed that they were about to attack. And that's a key point going forward. And then Al Jazeera, the documentary on the crossing, that's about the Yom Kippur War. I would recommend reading the Yom Kippur War article by Avi Shalom and then going through the documentary, which explains the intelligence failure to a part and actually explains what happened for those of you who are not familiar with the Yom Kippur War as well. And if you're not familiar with the Yom Kippur War, I would just recommend, you could read just an overview of it on Wikipedia before you start the section, just so you know the kind of the Arab-Israeli background for it. So if there's any questions or issues, please let me know, and I look forward to the discussion boards this week.